Now, branching off of the healthcare point, on an overall basis, are you satisfied with the job that President Obama has done in his first 2 years?
I'm very satisfied with what he's done. I'm less satisfied with how he's communicated it. There's obviously a lot of anger out there. I think many people are expecting it took us 8 years under Bush. In political terms, it took us 8 years to go from having a huge surplus when Bush came in the door to having a huge deficit. People forget that we lost 4 million jobs in this country under President Bush, that the TARP was done under President Bush, that the economy was falling apart under President Bush, and that President Obama was faced with a huge set of problems when he walked in the door, which no one had envisioned 2 years before when he first started running for president. I think he's done an amazing job. We've got health care, we had financial services reform, we had the stimulus bill, all over the solid opposition of the other side. So there's a lot that's happened in this country that's going to be giving us benefits for many years to come. I don't think that they've communicated that very well, and we'll see what happens in the election.
Now, this is really a federal question, but I think it's a good thing to ask, and that is, across the board, whether you're 18 or 90, from Democrat, Republican, from Connecticut, Texas, wherever, I think it's pretty fair to say that people on an overall basis would say that the government, really the federal government, is failing us. If you look at, we talked about cutting spending versus creating jobs. Well, you can't do both. You have a U.S. Senate right now where if you don't have 60 votes, it's pretty much you're not going to get anything done. So is this a case where this is a problem that you think can be fixed in the next 2 years, 4 years, or if ever, or is this a problem that kind of goes back to the Constitution days and now that it's starting to fail us here?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I think there's several answers to that. First of all, I don't agree with the premise that the federal government is failing us. As a blanket statement, I think that that's simply incorrect. I think the federal government, on the whole, does a really good job with what it does. And you can look at department after department and see that there are dedicated people there, they do a job, they've been given a job, and they get it done. There are obviously places they could be doing a whole lot better. The response, for example, to the oil spill this summer, I thought was very slow. When they finally got it together, I thought they did okay. When we see things go wrong, people get concerned. When things go right, they don't pay any attention. So, for example, we had the salmonella problem with eggs this summer. Well, so in the middle of that, you don't go out and say, well, let's cut back on the number of inspectors in the agriculture department. No, you say, where was the agriculture department and why weren't they on top of this? So in a situation like that, what people want is more effective government. 99% of the time, we don't have huge problems with salmonella in our society. Well, why is that? Because we have put in place a system of regulation, expectations, and those get carried out. So that's, I think in general, the federal government could do a lot better in some areas, but on the whole, if you, as I have, I've lived all over the world. I've traveled and worked in places like India. I've seen it where government doesn't work. This government works, and works really well. Politically, we're in a very difficult time. And I think that the Obama administration, their biggest failing was to not understand how the culture in Washington was going to remain so political rather than a culture of cooperation and trying to fix the problems. So looking at the stimulus bill, for example, they had to convince a couple of Republican senators to cross the line in order to get it done because of the 60 votes that you just talked about. That's a political problem. And that actually comes back not to the Constitution, because the Constitution says nothing about 60 votes. There's nothing in there that says that there's a right to filibuster, which is what they use. That's the Senate rule. And the Senate could change that whenever they want. So if and when people want to cooperate, they can. Now, there is actually a deeper question here, and one that is constitutional, and one that I don't see any change ever coming in, which is that small states like Utah, let's say, or like Rhode Island, have the same number of senators as large states like California or New York. Mm-hmm. So a voter in Utah or a voter in Rhode Island has much more influence over what happens. And you can see how the money goes. The money goes to the small states, and it always will.
Now, let's go back here and take this from a purely political standpoint. You ran for this seat 2 years ago against the same opponent and didn't win. So what in your mind do you think will be different this year?
It's more difficult, actually. It's always more difficult to run against an opponent who is an incumbent. And as we know, politically, this is a more difficult year for Democrats. So it's more difficult. I got 47% of the vote last time, which I thought was pretty good for someone who was running for office for the very first time. I hope to do better than that. I hope to win. We'll see.
Now, simply put, why should you be elected District 26 State Senator?
I think because I've got a very good understanding of what the problems are, and I'm willing to work with people to find the solutions. You know, some people say, cut, cut, cut. I don't think that you can simply cut your way out of this. As I've said before, if we cut $3 billion out of the budget, we'll lose 15,000 jobs for each $1 billion. I don't want to do that. So we need to find another way to get through. It's going to be difficult, but I'm willing to work with people, and I think I have a good grasp of what's going on.
All right, well, Mr. Hartwell, thanks so much for joining us here. Appreciate you coming on, and more on the trail coming up right after this.